All right, guys. So if you've already watched the first two videos in this first module, first part of the module 2, we have talked about extinction and we have talked about modeling, two core ideas related to behavior theory. And in some ways, these are concepts, but they're also kind of applications as well too. And as I've said with both of those are examples. I think that once you study and read about both those two, you'll probably realize, like I did the first time, that actually we see both of those around us all the time in our world, both the issue of extinction and the issue of modeling. And we want to talk next about shaping. Shaping is another one of those terms that if you study much behavior theory or if you do much research around the issue of behavior modification or cognitive behavior therapy, you oftentimes see this term shaping. And shaping is exactly what it says it is. It's, again, just another one of these core ideas that I want to review with you really, really quickly. And again, don't forget to go look at the PowerPoint presentation that I've made available for you, and also too for the lecture notes, because I give you some more information, especially in the lecture notes, on these ideas. Easiest way to remember shaping is to remember the term baby step or stair step. Many of you in the room, many of you in the class probably, if you've ever learned to play a musical instrument, is one of the best ways to think about it. If you've ever practiced an instrument or you've ever learned to play the piano or something like that, if you think about how you started, how did you get started? If you learned to play the piano, even if you've never taken piano lessons or learned to play a musical instrument, if you think about it, where do people start? Well, they start at the beginning. And if you learn to play the piano or learn to play a musical instrument, they always start you with the basics, learning the basic chords and learning the basic notes. And you got to kind of start like in kindergarten before you can play like in the orchestra. Start simple, you got to master some basics, and you move on like to the next phase. You got to master those basics and you move on like to the next phase. If you've ever learned to speak a foreign language, another good example, where when you learn to speak a foreign language, most of the time, if you learn like in a classroom, where do you start? Well, you start by learning the alphabet, and you start by learning the basic everyday, how to say your name, how to say hello, how to say goodbye, how to say good morning. You start with the basics, almost like kindergarten, right? And then you advance on, and then you advance on, and then you advance on. That's how all of us learned math, for example, when we were in grade school. We didn't start with algebra or calculus or trigonometry or geometry. We started with like basic subtraction and addition and division and numbers. And you learned that first, and then you took those skills and you went on to kind of like the next level, right? All of that is really kind of what shaping is. Shaping is basically where we take a larger behavior, a goal that we have, and we break it down into a bunch of smaller steps, because you can't just go from A to Z in one step. Now, sometimes we can go A to Z. Some behavior change is pretty simple. You may have been planning on going and eating at Chick-fil-A today, and at the last minute you change your mind, you go somewhere else. And that's pretty simple. I said, instead of driving here, you drive over here, you just change your mind and you do it, not a big deal. You might call that like A to Z behavior change. You can do it in one step. But a lot of behavior change and learning new behaviors, it's more complicated than that. And so one of the things that we know works is when you break behavior down into a bunch of little baby steps, and you start simple, and you reinforce people and teach people how to do step number 1 until they master it. And then they move to step number 2 and they master that. And then they move to step number 3, and all the way along, their behavior is just getting them closer and closer and closer to the larger goal. That's called shaping. And we see it in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of places. Again, many of you, if you're parents or grandparents, if you ever worked with children, we often do that basically with them. So shaping, it has those basic steps. Step number 1 is identifying a larger behavioral goal that maybe you want to be to, or you want someone to be at. And then breaking that down into several smaller steps and starting with step number 1, something really simple and basic that someone can do fairly easily. And each time they engage in that behavior, then you reward them or you praise them. And you don't worry about step number 3 or number 4 until they can do step number 1. And then once they've done step number 1, they've mastered it, well then you move to step number 2. And you then work on praise and reinforcement or positive consequences or whatever it may be to get them to master that step. And you keep moving. Those little baby steps are called successive approximations. And if you ever read much on shaping, I think I have a video I posted for you off of YouTube on shaping. I think the person who created that video, I think they talk about that term successive approximations. That is another term we use for those baby steps, right? So in the lecture notes, I give you another one of those real life examples that I want to just briefly kind of review with you here, just to give you an example of how shaping could look. And also too, by the way, let me mention this while I'm thinking about it. Next week in the second part of module number 2, we're going to talk about exposure therapies. And we're going to talk about 2. One is called systematic desensitization and one is called in vivo desensitization. And maybe you've heard of those before. And we're going to see shaping again next week when we talk about those 2 different approaches, which are related, but they're a little bit different. Because both of those have the word desensitization in them. Systematic desensitization and in vivo desensitization. Well, the term desensitization gives us it kind of implies something. And what it implies is that we're gradually, slowly getting used to something. So you'll see, I'll mention shaping again next week when we talk in the second part B of module number 2. But I put in the lecture notes just a really, really simple example of how we see shaping can be done. Some of you know a little bit about my background. Before I came to work at the college, I worked in foster care and an adoption agency down in Houston. And we had one of the things that made my agency where I worked kind of unique was we were licensed to do what's called therapeutic foster care. So therapeutic foster care meant that when parents came through and completed our licensing training and certification process, they took a bunch of extra classes that enabled them to foster parent children with special needs, children and teens with special needs. That could be behavioral issues, mental health issues, medical problems, developmental disabilities, that kind of thing. And not every foster care agency is trained and licensed to treat and care for those kind of kids. Well, we were licensed, and we had a special certification to where we could do that. So when CPS would take custody of a child in a wheelchair, or a child who had a hearing impairment, or a child with autism, or whatever, mental health issue, they often would call agencies like ours because we had foster parents who were kind of specially trained in not just parenting, but kind of that advanced kind of parenting of how to work with special needs kids. So we had a foster mom, a single lady who was one of our best foster parents, and she had in her home, we placed a young boy who had autism spectrum disorder. It was fairly mild, but he had a lot of limitations and deficits. He was about 9 years old. And he had unfortunately had a really rough 9 years, unfortunately. He had been physically abused. He had been neglected. We talked about modeling last video. He really had not had a lot of very good role models in his 9 years. He really had never, ever had a parent or an adult teach him, nurture him, unfortunately love him. He didn't know how to tie his shoes. He had problems going to the bathroom by himself. He just kind of had lived in this chaotic kind of world for 9 years. Plus, he had this struggle called autism in addition to all that. So when she got him, one of her rules in her house was that every kiddo, she had 2 or 3 kids, he was one of them, she had chores. She had appropriate household responsibilities for everybody in the house. So one of the things she shared with me, she said, when he first came into my house, I kind of struggled with something I could give him that would be appropriate that he could do because he didn't know how to do anything. So she said, one of the things that I started with him was I thought about getting him at the end, every evening they would sit at the dinner table and eat dinner. And she said, at first I thought, what would be easy? I'm gonna make him responsible for whenever we're done, he has to clear the table, get all the dishes into the kitchen and into the sink, and help me load the dishwasher. So he's 9. That's not inappropriate for a 9-year-old to do. She said he didn't even know what clearing the table meant. When I started kind of working with him, I mean, he didn't even understand when I said, well, stack the, she said he didn't understand any of that. Now, part of that was because of his experiences. Part of that is because of his autism. So here's what I still remember today, here's what she said to me. She said, so I kind of broke it down and started like baby step. So the first thing I did was I showed him how to, when I said clear the table, I taught him and showed him that what I mean by that is you gather all the plates and the dishes up and you stack them at like the end of the table. And she said, I figured that was about all he could handle, at least initially. She said, I taught him that. I showed him, I modeled for him, using modeling. I showed him how to do it. And I said, now you do it. And he did it. It took him a little bit, but he did it. She said the first night I just praised him, gave him a high five. Said, that's awesome. That's your job. From now on, every night I want you to help me clear. You're the best table clearer I've ever seen, right? And he went on his way. She did that for 3 or 4 nights. That's his job. Cleaning, and she said he did it for 3 or 4 nights. I praised him, told him how awesome he was, and he did a great job. And she said after about 3 or 4 nights, I noticed I didn't have to remind him anymore. He would just do it. He kind of had learned, okay, this is my job, right? And so he was doing it, right? So she said that kind of was my cue that he was ready to go to step 2, successive approximations. Or her ultimate goal is to get him loading the dishwasher. That's the ultimate goal, right? So step 2 was, she said, I just told him, okay, now here's what I want you to do next. And she said, I had him move the dishes from the table into the sink. Real simple. But for him, that was something that was maybe a little challenging for him a little bit, right? He had some physical problems. He had some emotional issues or whatever. So she said, so I added to sort of chore number 1, this second piece. And that was getting the dishes from the kitchen table to the sink. And she said, I had to kind of show him how to do it. I had to kind of show him how to kind of carry stuff. And it was real basic. First time he did it by himself, I just praised him. She said, I told him how awesome he was, gave him a high five. And she said that was about as far as he could go. He did that then for several more days, so she's kind of taking a little baby step, right? A baby step of going from just clearing the table and stacking the dishes to moving everything into the kitchen, right? And then she said, after 3 or 4 or 5 nights, I noticed I wasn't having to remind him. She said, and then I knew he's got it. He's mastered, we'll call it step 2, right? And she said, he just struggled, I think because of his autism I couldn't just say to him, load the dishwasher. Because for him, he's 9, number 1. He needs to be shown kind of how to do it the best way or whatever. And because of his autism, that was really overwhelming to him. So she said, I kind of had to coach him. I showed him. I worked with him a little bit and kind of showing him how to clean the dishes in the sink and then get into the dishwasher. And it took a little bit of time. And I praised him. And she said, so within a couple of weeks, didn't take very long, a couple of weeks, he went from not knowing how to do anything. What do you even mean when you say clear the table? To clearing the table, moving the dishes, cleaning the dishes in the sink, loading the dishwasher. How did she do that? She didn't just say, well, do it. He couldn't handle that. So what she did was she broke it down, real simple. She broke that larger behavior, loading the dishwasher, down into about 3 or 4 little baby steps, each step closer to the larger goal, right? So shaping is one of those things that we see around us all of the time. Bottom line is you focus on mastering each individual step before you move on to the next step. That's a key idea. Another key idea is you use positive reinforcement or you use positive consequences as a way to reinforce, as a way to teach, right? In this case with this foster son, it was praise and high fives because he's 9. And because of where he was developmentally, he kind of had come from a background where he had probably never had anyone tell him how awesome he was. Unfortunately, she was probably the first person in his life ever to say, hey man, you are awesome. You do a great job. You're doing a great job. And that was very rewarding. It was very positive. It was very reinforcing to him. So she found what kind of worked for him, and she praised him. And so we use positive reinforcement, or we use positive consequences as a way to kind of reinforce and to teach each little step. And like I said, next week we're going to see that again when we talk about in vivo desensitization and systematic desensitization. I'll mention this last as well too, with shaping. I mentioned before learning to play a musical instrument. I mentioned before math. I mentioned learning a foreign language, and how you start small and kind of build up, kind of master, and then kind of build up as an example of shaping. My hunch is we probably have many animal lovers in class, and dogs especially. Through the years, I've had, maybe you have too, I've had friends and students and colleagues who have bragged or posted on Facebook all kinds of tricks or all kinds of new behaviors that they had taught, whether it was a bird or whether it was a dog or something like that, right? You know, most times when a dog or an animal is taught a new trick, it's used through shaping. You just don't say, here, do this, do this trick or do this behavior. You know, if you wanted to teach your dog to go to the door and put their paw on the door handle, or when they want to go out, or whatever it may be, usually you find a consequence that is favorable and positive, like food or a treat, and you use that to basically, one step at a time, one little behavior at a time, teach, in this case, I'm using a dog as an example, to teach then a dog a new behavior that then is built on and built on and built on. So all that is called shaping. This idea of baby step or a stair-step approach, taking one at a time, taking one step at a time, mastering one step at a time, using positive reinforcement consequences, whatever that may look like, to reinforce people and teach them the behavior, and not worrying about step 2 and step 3 until step number 1 is mastered. So sort of like modeling and extinction. Shaping is one of those old school behavioral ideas that we see examples, all kinds of examples of around us in our world today. I mentioned to you a minute ago a video. I posted a couple of videos for you in this module off of YouTube that I think are real good, kind of give some examples of shaping. So make sure you check those out and watch the next little mini lecture video on token economies. All right, have a good day. See you soon.